Great to be here. We've got a really high-powered panel here, a very relevant, timely panel on ISIS and the Middle East changing geopolitical landscape. Just to my right, Nancy Okail is our host for this week. She's the executive director of the Tahrir Institute with long experience working in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt, where she was actually found guilty in a trial for her NGO work over there. She's recently conducted some field work on ISIS on the Turkish-Syrian border. We also, on the far right, have Mia Bloom. She's a professor of communications at Georgia State University in Atlanta, who's focused especially on the recruitment of women and children into terrorism. We're often on CNN together. Michael Weiss, sitting next to her, is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Center on International Security and a senior editor at the Daily Beast. He's the co-author of a New York Times bestseller, ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. He often also sits with me on CNN. It's going to be a busy day today, I can tell you. The co-author on that book, Hassan Hassan, is also here. He's a resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and he's done some of the best research on ISIS, Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. This panel, very, very timely this morning. Over the weekend, we have had what appears to have been three terrorist incidents in the United States. Not clear who was responsible yet for that, but I think we're going to find out a lot more in the hours ahead. And when we think about ISIS, there's really good news and there's bad news. The good news is that ISIS has been pushed back in Syria, Iraq, and Libya, but the bad news is they've been ratcheting up their international terror attack planning, plotting, particularly against Europe. And the first question really is for Nancy, and it's to get your assessment of the progress in this war on ISIS. Are we winning, and what does winning even mean?
Thank you, Paul. And before I start, I would just like to thank Concordia. This is the second year that we partner together on this, unfortunately, remaining to be a timely topic on ISIS. Hopefully, sometime soon it would be obsolete. And it's great to share the panel with Mia, Mike, and Hassan, great experts that I learn a lot from working with them and discussing with them these issues. Let me just take a look at your question, and there are two ways to look at it. One way to think about from the military perspective, or look at the progress that has been made and what criteria can we see if we really are progressing or winning the war against ISIS. If we think about territory, they have been losing territory. In 2015, they lost about 14% of the land they had. This year, they lost 12%. Very recently, I mean, Turkey was able to sort of, as they say, cleanse it in Jarablus and Arai. And Erdogan today actually said they are moving forward to Al-Bab, which is going to be a huge deal. I mean, like, if they are able to move on to that direction. So in terms of territory, yes, that's progress. In terms of resources as well, I mean, Voice of America, I think, published something yesterday. It shows that they lost 30% of their finances, and that's because of their inability to have control over the oil refineries. They are becoming less able to pay the same rates to the recruits and their fighters. And again, this is, I mean, a good move, because some of the fighters, I mean, there are several, as you all know, there are several reasons why people join ISIS. The religious reason is just one aspect of it, but there's also the security and the finances, and they're losing in both. And lastly, in terms of the military aspect, I think the most important part is the issue of the attack on the leadership of ISIS. I mean, they lost 40, I think, of their top leadership. I mean, started by Al-Ambari and Shishani, and then on the August 30th, I mean, Adnani, who is the spokesperson of ISIS, I mean, a huge figure and a leading figure. And then when they replaced him by Wael Fayad, who was known as, Wael al-Rawi, who was basically responsible of the media propaganda, Al-Furqan, And then he was also killed. So apparently this is a huge blow to it, and I think Mike and Hassan can talk about the implication of this blow to the governance aspect. But let's stop here for a minute, because if we look at the war on ISIS on those three aspects, then we're looking at ISIS as a state, and we are acknowledging it and treating it as a state in the sense of international relation, a land that is governed by an authority and have resources, and they are having means of control over it. But if we treat it as a terror group, that's a different story, and the criteria of whether we're winning or not is different. And it becomes more of their ability to spread their ideology, to attract recruits and have an ability to influence people. And the most important thing is inflicting harm. So something like that, what you've heard, claiming the attack in Minnesota most recently, and things like that, is an indication that the issue is not just the territorial part or the military part, but treating it not as a state. If we abandon the first three criteria and look at it as a terror group, then we should look at it differently, because there are unintended consequences of the kind of pressure that they are under right now. And this is the hard part that we should push ourselves to think about. For example, because of the pressure they are under now, they are resorting to recruiting children. And this is something that Mia studies very deeply, and she's going to talk about it. The other thing also, thinking about how they are becoming more brutal with the territories that were supportive of them. For example, most recently in the village of Al-Tabni, which is west of Deir ez-Zor, where Hassan is from, they slaughtered 20 men because they suspected their connections with Ahrar al-Sham, and even some of the coalition connections there. The tribal people in the village try to actually come back to it, even have a funeral for their relatives, and they had a sort of a mini uprising and revolted against ISIS. And this was it's an interesting moment there. It was a small scale, but interesting. But unfortunately, they were not able to continue because they didn't have the support. The third thing, and this is going to be my final word before we go into like the more in-depth thing, is that their ability to, again, recruit within the people. I was talking a couple of days ago with some of the rebels on the Turkish borders, and they were explaining, one of the ways of their recruits is the Sharia courses, and after the Sharia courses, they gather them and say who would want to join Daesh or ISIS, because ISIS, contrary to all other groups, they are always voluntary recruit, because it's an aspect of loyalty. There are no compulsory recruits. And the number of people who are willing to join are less and less because of all the different things. So that puts them at risk, and that pushes them to issues that Hassan and Mike and Mia would talk about, and I was like, how is that going to, the implication of this on the war? Okay, so we've got this idea that they're having recruitment challenges inside Syria and Iraq. Mia's done some of the best research on the intersection between youth, child soldiers, and ISIS. You wrote in the journal I edit, CTC Sentinel, that they're mobilizing youth at an unprecedented and accelerating rate. Why are they doing that? Is it because they're running out of male recruits, or are they trying to blood a new generation, or is it a combination? It's a combination. One of the things that we discovered, and I wrote the piece with Dr. John Horgan, who's my co-author on the book as well, is that unlike the child soldiers in Africa, where you had dedicated units in Mozambique and Liberia and DRC, what ISIS is doing is that they're using this thing called Ingamasi. So it's a mixture of adults with children. Now, these children disproportionately are Syrian and Iraqi children. The children you see in the videos, however, are overwhelmingly the foreign children. And so it gives you the impression, and they released a video called 100%, which if you say it quickly in French, it sounds like 100%, but it's actually blood for blood, back in May. And these are diverse, attractive,
children all wearing uniforms, they're fully equipped. These were the same kids that on August 26th were shown in a video executing 5 Kurdish men, shooting them in the head. So they have what I would call maybe pageant children, and these are the ones that they are training for the next generation. They've taken over the schools, they've emptied the orphanages, but they also are mixing children into units. Interestingly enough, although Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which as Michael and Hassan's book is the precursor to ISIS, make that very clear, it's an excellent book, Al-Qaeda in Iraq used women suicide bombers, and ISIS has been very reticent about using women in that way. The way ISIS uses women is to have babies, so they are trying to groom the next generation, but also they're using them as a form of commodity to reward the male foreign fighters. So, we're seeing a lot of things that are similar to previous terrorist groups and insurgency groups. We're also seeing some unique elements as well.
Great. Hassan, I mean, there's a theme here this morning of ISIS under pressure, the ground campaign against it, also the air campaign from the international coalition. To what degree is that putting pressure on their ability to govern? How sustainable is their so-called caliphate?
Thank you. It's a good question. Because I come from that area, I want to highlight some of the kind of the ground truth related to that. So basically, I think generally in ISIS areas, there's a normal life to a certain degree. Normal in the sense that it's quiet, people go to the market, come back. There is a monopoly over violence. ISIS is the only side that does the violence, does the shooting, and so on and so forth. That is in contrast to, remember 2 years ago, people when they want to go to the market, they have to either have a gun on their hands or risk being killed when they engage in a fight and so on and so forth. Now it's easy, for example, to go from Aleppo all the way to Mosul and you're sort of kind of safe. You can drive in ISIS areas. So there's that monopoly, and I think in that sense, security is going to be it's going to be something that people inside ISIS areas will have to keep in mind when they weigh their options, who's coming to the area, whether Syrian rebels or Kurds or Iraqi government. There's that. I mean, it's paradoxical because obviously people are familiar with the story of ISIS. It's violent. People go from their home. They risk seeing, severed heads on pipes in the streets or in the kind of central areas. But we should not really undermine the importance of security that ISIS provided since it took over the areas from Fallujah to Mosul all the way to Aleppo. And I think that semblance of governance, of order in these areas is going to be very important. It's going to be something that people will try to, kind of consider when other people are trying to provoke them to rebel against ISIS and so on and so forth. In terms of governance and ISIS' ability to govern, ISIS, we have to remember that it still controls 50% of the areas it controlled in 2014 in Iraq and Syria. This is a massive source of income for ISIS. I think people focus disproportionately on oil fields and the resources that that ISIS get from the oil. But I think that's not a very important kind of source for ISIS. So it's not like a crucial source for ISIS. Remember that ISIS took all the areas today under its control, including Mosul and Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and other areas, and before that in Fallujah and other areas, took most of these areas, and today I would say all of the areas that ISIS controls today, before it controlled any oil field. So it's important to have that in mind as well, of the ability of ISIS to take areas without really controlling the resources that we imagined that would be critical to kind of the demise of ISIS or the rise of ISIS. I think what ISIS is trying to do today is focus on the taxation of people, trying to get as much money as possible from people, but also from weapons and the way they seize weapons and they do these hit and they go on an offensive, they take weapons and they go back. Also remember, I'm going to end there, remember that ISIS operations today are cheaper than before, because they no longer operate as a conventional army. They no longer sweep into areas or roll into areas with large convoys. Today they move with small, highly mobile units, sometimes 3 people, 3 to 9 people. They rely so heavily today on snipers, on suicide attackers to go and infiltrate enemy lines.
So this is a resilient organization. It's going to stick around for some time. It's also a very, very well-resourced organization, the richest terrorist group in history. And Michael, that kind of brings up the point about their international attack planning. We all know that they've been ratcheting that up, particularly against Europe. But have we really seen the full extent of what they could be capable of yet, given that the Paris attacks, according to some estimates, cost just perhaps $10,000? Are they moving perhaps through the gears now? Could they be capable of significantly worse and more complex attacks?
I think they're definitely capable of it, and I think it was a sort of a mistaken assumption on the part of those trying to consider this to be a pivot or an adjustment of ISIS's strategy. You recall, Al-Qaeda in Iraq always wanted to export jihad. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi waged, there was an abortive chemical weapons attack in Amman in 2005, a very successful hotel bombing spree, which the Jordanians to this day consider their 9/11. Now you might say, well, that's still within the region of the Levant, so it doesn't count. But the goal was always to bring it to Europe and to North America if they have their druthers. What I'm seeing now, and it's interesting listening to Mias talk about the kind of United Colors of Benetton advertising that they do, making this seem more internationalist and more Europeanized than it perhaps is. There is internally a Europeanization process taking place. Nancy mentioned al-Shashani. This was essentially a battlefield commander, the emir of Aleppo, and one of the first non-Arabs to be appointed to such a high position within the organization, if you take it from its origins 13 years ago as AQI. He was a Georgian national, an ethnic Chechen, actually fought in the Georgian army against Russia in 2008, was himself trained by the US Army as part of the Georgian Special Forces. I'm seeing from my own reporting and sources from within ISIS and recently defected from ISIS, the head of their Amn al-Karji. They have 4 intelligence branches, modeled very much on like the regional Mukhabarat or indeed Western security services. The Amn al-Karji would be their CIA, in charge of all foreign operations, including the Paris and Brussels attacks. This guy, his nom de guerre, his kunya is Abu Suleiman al-Faransi. Al-Faransi means the Frenchman. Why? Because he was born in Toulouse. He is Moroccan or Tunisian by ancestry, but he came over to Syria around 2013 with his French-born wife and their 2 French-born children. And he, according to sources that I have inside the organization, played a direct role in conceptualizing the Paris attacks. And his reward for the spectacular success of that operation was to be appointed the head of the Amn al-Karji. His predecessor was a Tunisian. So that, to me, represents a kind of sea change in the thinking of ISIS. They're now leaning increasingly on native-born Westerners, Europeans, who know the terrain, know, as one ISIS defector put it about al-Faransi, know what the strengths and also the vulnerabilities of Western societies are. So when it comes to scouting soft targets, cafes, boulevards, you name it, I mean, Bataclan-type theaters, these are the guys who are going to be at the vanguard. And it's interesting, I mean, if you want a sort of Cold War analogy, this is what I consider to be the establishment of an ISIS Comintern or a Jihadi International. They are looking to export this through their Wilayat program, the establishment of colonial outposts in West Africa, in the Sinai Peninsula, in Afghanistan. You mentioned Egypt, Nancy, and Yemen. Now, these are places where ISIS HQ may not have command and control yet, but increasingly you're going to see them. I mean, right now in northern Syria, what's taking place is Turkish-backed rebels and coalition-backed Kurds are steadily pushing ISIS out of it's called the Manbij pocket in Aleppo. So they've lost Manbij, they've lost Jarablus, and the last remaining city that they have to lose is Al-Bab. Al-Bab is the headquarters of the Amn al-Karji. So that's where their Langley is. If they lose Al-Bab, I'd be very curious to see what the transformation is going to look like. If they're smart, and I suspect that they are, and they've been planning for the loss of Al-Bab, because they plan for the loss of even more territory, and they've been doing that actually even before the establishment of the caliphate, because they think in the long term. If they lose Al-Bab, they will have taken out many of their foreign operatives and their foreign operation planners and relocated them elsewhere. no doubt within Syria and Iraq, maybe to Mosul, maybe to Deir ez-Zor, where they still have a very entrenched presence, or maybe back to Raqqa. Al-Faransi apparently has fled Syria, and it is rumored, it has been reported, although not really substantiated, that he was captured by the Turkish military, and to take it one step further, may have even been turned over to French intelligence. Now, if they have him, chances are they have a very good handle on forthcoming planned long-term operations. That's not to say, though, that the continent is safe. I mean, Paul, you've done remarkable work reporting on Belgium. The old line after 9/11, I think it was Mayor Bloomberg, said that if you pick up a jihadi anywhere in the world, chances are he's got a map of Manhattan in his pocket. Today, he's got a map of Paris. And we saw this a few weeks ago, right, with the Notre Dame thankfully interrupted or unsuccessful possible attack.
Let's talk a very quick follow here on the threat to the United States from ISIS, and perhaps just explain what the threat is very, very quickly from ISIS to the homeland. We're talking here about an ISIS-directed plot. What kind of capability do they have in your assessment?
The threat I've seen, and if you look at the FBI complaints and the people who've been rounded up in the last 2 years, it's mostly ISIS-inspired, people who have been ideologized remotely through the internet or social media, rather than ISIS-directed. I mean, we have a rather large expanse of geography separating the caliphate from North America. You can literally drive from Raqqa to Paris, right? I mean, it's a long journey, but you can do it. You can't do that here, and it means usually boarding a plane or a boat. So I'm not worried in particular about people coming back from Syria and Iraq here, but what I am worried about is they still have a very powerful, I hate the word narrative, especially because the US government uses it ad nauseum and it's become such a cliche, but they do. They sell themselves, not just in Islamic terms, not just in world historical, sort of the restoration of Sunni power and prestige. In ultra-violent, you don't even have to be Muslim to be drawn to this kind of thing. We've seen random lunatics and psychopaths with, petty gangsterism records, or they've been incarcerated for, violent crime in the past, being drawn to ISIS simply because there's a coolness factor to this. They're dressed in black. They take out on their enemies. They have the sanguinary, capacity that we wish we could have here. That is the danger. And what worries me is what I've termed the invisible soldiers of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, people that aren't even known to ISIS, who want to pledge allegiance to ISIS and are already planning operations in the West in the name of the caliphate.
And just over the weekend, we saw an attack in Minnesota, ISIS claiming that they inspired this individual, that he was answering their call. That's not yet fully been confirmed. We'll have to see whether that was the case. But this is General Assembly Week here at the UN. Nancy, what does the international community need to do, which it isn't already doing, to defeat ISIS and to sustain the defeat of ISIS?
Well, I think it's important to go back to the 5 dimensions of the coalition, the anti-ISIS coalition. I think on 3 fronts, maybe the approach is progressing. We're talking, the 5 dimensions mainly are the military operations. Second is stopping the finances, cutting the lifeline to, their finances. Second, stopping the foreign fighters from joining ISIS, just crippling their ability, like human resources. And fourth is the messaging, their ability to, launch their propaganda and attract more people through their messaging. And fifth, and the most important part, is what is called stabilization and reconstruction, which is basically talks about, if we always say, like, ISIS is a symptom. There are root causes for it. The war the civil war in Syria, sectarianism, and all the injustice that a lot of people are seeing are just fueling and supporting and creating this fertile ground for people to join ISIS. So I think the most important thing is to think about, how to invest. We're just, like Mike was saying, how there's progress, they're losing territories, but it's important how to fill that vacuum after they leave and support people who would be able to, build and develop and establish, instead of filling this gap with another, sort of threat. So this is an important thing to think about for sustainability of the approach. And I think also, there's an indirect way also to combat that, because as we see there are a lot of authoritarian regime would use the war and terror to clamp down on any form of opposition towards them. And that's actually a very, also important source of people who find affinity to that there are no, peaceful venues for them to operate. Then they go and find the only way to go is to join those groups because they are fighting the dictators, they are fighting, or at least this is how they present themselves. So this is an indirect way, but it is important to keep the space open for those, peaceful voices to continue to, operate freely and effectively in a way.
Well, it's a powerful point, and if you think of the 9/11 attacks, think of Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker, somebody who was radicalized by his experience under the Mubarak regime and was very angry at the US support for that regime. There's a debate about democracy versus authoritarian regimes. I just came back from a high-level conference in Israel. The view over there is very much stability first, but as we've been hearing from Nancy, that also may produce security threats for the United States in the time to come. Mia, wondering if you could weigh in on that and also on what the international community needs to better do to really empower Muslims around the world to defeat ISIS.
So there's three things that I wanted to add. First of all, one of the things that we are seeing, and this is connected to what Hassan was saying, there are splinters that are emerging within the so-called caliphate between the foreigners and the locals, between the Ansar, which are the locals, and the Mujahideen, who are the foreigners. And we might be able to exploit that because the foreign fighters get more money salary, they get first choice of the home, they get first choice of the woman or the sex slave, so that there are these inequalities that are now becoming systematic that are really irritating the locals. And I think that there might be an opportunity to exploit that, and I don't want to say in counter narratives, but there is something to consider that in many of the countries that we've seen where they've prevented the foreign fighters from leaving, they just do something local. And so by preventing the exodus of foreign fighters, inadvertently you might be keeping them close to home and they'll be able to do horrible things there. But we need to make a distinction between the directed events that we see in France or in Belgium versus what we've been seeing in the United States. And I think overwhelmingly it's incumbent upon us, and especially Paul and Michael, you're on CNN a lot, to make that distinction, because if every random act of criminal violence perpetrated by a Muslim, that they can then justify it by putting on the veneer of respectability by calling it ISIS, we say, oh yeah, that's also ISIS. We allow ISIS to project its power in a way that as it's waning, as Nancy and Hassan have described, and as Michael has described, we are giving them more power by saying, yes, they're responsible for all these attacks. When in fact, we have to make that distinction. Just because someone pledges allegiance to ISIS doesn't mean that they're actually ISIS. And there are ways that we have been working with the US government to show when it really is ISIS and when it's wannabe ISIS. That said, there is a long debate in the Middle East that predates even ISIS about whether democracy is the ideal scenario in places where it has been suppressed for so long. Because time and time again, whether it was Algeria in the 90s or Iran in the 70s, the moment the political realm opens up ever so slightly, the groups that emerge are not the groups that will ordinarily ally with the United States. These will be groups that are very much connected to the mosque or the majlis, because that's where the money is. That's the only sector of government that the previous authoritarians have not been able to completely eradicate. And so Islamic fundamentalism tends to be the organizations or the parties that get elected. And we have to be very careful that we don't see religiosity and Islamic parties as being the same thing as terrorism. So that, we have Islamic countries in the world that are democracies. We have fully functioning Islamic parties in Indonesia or Turkey. And we don't want to assume that if it's Islamic, it's automatically ISIS. In the same way that I would say we don't want to assume if it's an act of violence anywhere in the United States, in Orlando or in San Bernardino, that it's automatically ISIS. ISIS claims very selectively, but they love the idea of being able to portray itself as being powerful, even though it's become far less powerful at home.
Thank you very much. Hassan, it's crunch time in Syria and Iraq. There's a lot of speculation that there's going to be an attempt to take back Mosul in the coming weeks, months, also Raqqa. What are going to be the challenges, though, in taking back these towns that ISIS control? And even if they are taken back, what are the risks that ISIS could sort of re-emerge in different forms if they don't manage to stitch back the political fabric of these countries together?
Sure. I think the campaign against ISIS obviously has reached a very critical point. So if you look at the map in Iraq and Syria, so 50% of the areas under ISIS are now shrunk into a region from Mosul to Al-Bukamal or Deir ez-Zor, all the way to Raqqa. This area, the horn of ISIS, if you like, has become, I think politics has become very important. Today, I think politics and the political implications and the grievances behind why ISIS rose in the first place becomes more important than ever before. I think more important than for example, when the Iraqi army, for example, swept into Fallujah. That was a military challenge more than a political one. But now, because Mosul, for example, if you look at the Mosul and how many stakeholders want to get into Mosul and want to fight in Mosul, there's so many. Turkey is involved, the Kurds are involved, the Iraqi army and the Iranians want to get involved in there. Not only these people in Iraq and Turkey, but also YPG in Syria. If you listen to their conversations, they actually want to go to Mosul and fight there because obviously they have a sphere of influence along the Syrian-Iraqi border that they want to maintain in opposition to other Kurdish elements in Iraq. So the politics will make this much more complicated than the 50% of the areas that have already been taken. So it's a really critical transition. One of the themes that I noticed recently in ISIS conversations and ISIS publications is something they call inhiyaz ila sahra. They have, which means in Arabic, retreat into the desert. This is something they have already started talking about, even though they still have 50% of the land under their control. For example, in my own area, which is a province that ISIS calls Wilayat al-Furat, which combines Iraq and Syria, it's the only province that combines the both countries or areas in the two countries. They produced a video, very interesting video, I think, because in the video, all the kind of the footage is in the desert, and they film how they took control of a camp in the middle of the desert that they say was established and secured by the Americans and the Shia government in Iraq. They are preparing their people psychologically into this retreat, that they are going back to the period from 2008 to 2012 when they were operating mostly in the desert. And they say, for example, and they actually explain that. They say in that period, we left behind what they call Mafariz Amniya, or the security operatives in these areas, to launch a campaign of terror, assassination, going after people who fought them, while the people in the desert, or the fighters in the desert, come back later. So I think this is we're witnessing a kind of a joint, a combination of expansion and contraction of ISIS. Expansion as in trying to develop international networks of terror, trying to appeal to people outside the core of Iraq and Syria, but at the same time, they're preparing for the fallback.
Thank you very much. Michael, US officials have warned about foreign fighters as they leave Syria and Iraq, that they could become a generational threat, perhaps a multi-generational threat. We're talking about the largest foreign fighter mobilization in history, with thousands of Westerners. How do you see that threat playing out over the coming years and decades, and what can be done by the international community to contain it?
Well, the first thing is control the border. Turkey has, in recent months, I should say, taken a much more robust approach to patrolling their own sort of designated areas in the borderland region with Syria. I think that's just by necessity. I mean, we saw the devastating attacks in Istanbul. I mean, the Erdogan government now realizes it's helped create this problem by allowing the border to be a sieve. I mean, I've crossed the border myself with ease, and I don't look like I'm a Syrian national, if I may say so myself. I think so that's crucial. Number two, though, there is this element, and I really don't, I have never heard a coherent or really especially clever answer about defeating the sort of ideological milieu or the propaganda. Foreign fighters go off to be foreign fighters because there's something about an organization like ISIS that draws them in. What I'm seeing now, in fact, the United States is waging two wars. There's a battlefield war against ISIS, and then there's the war against the unintended consequences of the first war. Hassan alluded to sort of the changing layers or regional dynamics. What do we see taking place? Kurds are building a state in northern Syria, right? And they're doing so under the air cover of F-18s above them and special forces embedded with them on the ground. This is gravely antagonizing Arab and Turkmen populations in northern Syria who see the Kurds in many respects as conquerors even worse than ISIS, right? Because they don't come from the same constituency or the same sort of ethnic background. In Iraq, you have an Iraqi security apparatus that is increasingly beholden to and controlled by Iran's Quds Force. And these militia groups that are going in and clearing terrain and cities from which ISIS has been expelled are committing war crimes and human rights abuses and essentially waging anti-Sunni pogroms or terrorizing and alienating the Sunni populations. Foreign fighters are turning on the television and they think the United States is behind this. I mean, and this is very crucial because if you go back to the first public sermon Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi gave in the Al-Zangi Mosque in July of 2014, what did he say? Well, he said a lot of things, but one of the things that struck me in the sort of geopolitical assessment of ISIS is today there is a global conspiracy being led by the United States and Russia, backed by Iran and the Rafida and the Nusayris. So the Alawite regime of Bashar al-Assad and the Iraqi Shia population, which is in control of large levers of the government and now also the security apparatus. At what point does that conspiracy theory sort of dovetail with or align with unintended foreign policy, right? I mean, you've seen now the United States accidentally bombed about 80 Syrian soldiers. Russia has cried bloody murder and accused the United States of being behind ISIS, a propaganda point that is backed by the Iranian and the Syrian regime itself. ISIS is waiting and watching and listening to the U.S. essentially go on bended knee before Damascus and say, we're sorry, we have no quarrel with you, this is only against extremism, but really Sunni extremism. We're not touching Hezbollah, we're not touching the Quds Force, we're not touching Asayib al-Haq and any of these other groups which are just as bad as ISIS. And so for ISIS, this is music to its ears because that is going to galvanize more foreign fighters. That is going to bring people into the fold. And just to touch on one of Mia's points, I'll give you an anecdote that I heard. And one of the things nobody is talking about, but I think they ought to, is what happens if the Europeans of ISIS try to mount a coup against the Arabs? It's not all that unfathomable, especially if they lose Raqqa and Mosul and they have to go elsewhere. The Chechen, or the post-Soviet contingent within ISIS, is seen as terrifying to the ISIS leadership. The Chechens came back to Raqqa at one point. They were recalled from Aleppo, and the emir of Raqqa was so worried that these guys were going to open fire on the Raqqa administration that he put snipers on the rooftops and pointed their guns. I mean, these are seen as the most badass of the militancy. That's why Shoshani was essentially named a field commander. It started as foreign fighter-led. Zarqawi was Jordanian. He brought with him a lot of Jordanians. He trained in the Herat training camp in Afghanistan. Egyptians, Algerians, Saudis, whatever, Libyans. Then it became a fake Iraqized insurgency where he tried to essentially conduct a PR campaign that made it seem domestic rather than international because Iraqis were bridling at what they considered to be another form of foreign occupation. Now it's becoming Europeanized. What happens if the Europeans take this over? And I don't mean that they control or govern the terrain in the Middle East, but they are essentially running the show in terms of all foreign operations abroad, which is what everyone in this auditorium is most concerned about.
Well, a lot to ponder. Please join me in thanking our panel for their many insights, lots of fascinating things to think about. Thank you very much, guys.